Hello, my name is Ashley Resch, and this is my presentation on Emily Dickinson for Centenary University. I'm going to start with a bit of background information on Emily and her family. Emily was born on December 10th, 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts. She also died in 1886 in Amherst, Massachusetts when she was 56 years old. Emily's mother was Emily Norcross. There's not very much known about her. She was known as kind of the passive wife. She enjoyed domestic life, but didn't have a close relationship with any of her children. She was considered well educated as a woman of the time and came from a large family. I believe she was one of 9 siblings. Emily's father was Edward Dickinson. He went to Yale before becoming a lawyer. He ended up taking over his father's failing law practice when he graduated. He also spent some time on the Massachusetts state legislature and state senate, but neither of those were very long-lasting. He didn't have a very close relationship with Emily, neither did Emily's mother, but neither relationships were seen in a negative light or seemed to come across that way in Emily's future writings. Emily also had an older brother, William Austin Dickinson, but he went by Austin his whole life. They had a pretty close relationship. Emily ends up being his confidant later while he's in school, and she's very close with his future wife, Susan Gilbert, who he marries in 1856. Susan kind of takes over that relationship with Emily as they become very close, and Susan becomes Emily's comrade and confidant when she begins writing her poetry. Emily also had a younger sister, Lavinia or Vinnie Dickinson. They were very close, but they were kind of opposites. Emily was known to depend on her in social situations, as Vinnie was more of the outgoing one of the two. Moving on to Emily's education, she only attended 2 formal schools, one being Amherst Academy, which she attended for 7 years. Emily enjoyed all aspects of school and was considered an eager student by her teachers. She did show a particular interest in science, or chemic force, which was later reflected in her poetry. At the time, religion and science were related subjects, but Emily considered religion the least compelling aspect of science, which kind of started her religious rebellion that goes on the rest of her life. At this school, Emily met her first master, Leonard Humphrey, who contributed to her development as a poet. He was thought to have sparked her interest in poetry. Amherst was the last place that Emily had a group of friends. It was only about 4 or 5 girls, and one of them was Susan Gilbert, but this was the last place she was known to have a group of friends instead of individual ones. The second school she attended was Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. This school was known for its religious predilection. It put their students into categories, basically. Christians expressed hope and without hope. Emily was considered without hope, which might have contributed to her not returning for her second year there. This school was the end of her formal education, as she didn't return and did not go to a different one afterwards. No one's really sure why Emily didn't return, but it's assumed that either her father made her come home or from homesickness she didn't return, as a lot of her letters at the time talked about how much she missed living at home. Once Emily did return home, she was expected to embrace domestic life and take over the homestead. She was also expected to become a wife at some point, but Emily showed no interest in being somebody's wife and disliked all housework except for cooking and gardening, but only for herself. She also disliked social calls and social visits, which was pretty much the only way to stay socially relevant at the time, which kind of made her an outcast in the town. Around town, she was also referred to as a wit from the way that she spoke with a sharp edge. It means intelligent, but it was more of an insult at the time. Around this time, she also became her brother's confidant, which was the only role she was expected to take that she did take happily. She told her brother that his success depended on his ruthless intellectual honesty, which I think tells more about her character than his, but she continues as his confidant well into adulthood. Her rebellion against religion also continues when she returns home. Everyone she knows has joined the church, but she still refuses to. This is thought to have caused issues with her friends and family, specifically Susan Gilbert, who she had a very close relationship with, but in 1854, their letters became more cryptic and cold towards each other, and religion is one of the reasons she's suspected to have gotten in a fight with Susan. But either Austen or just their feelings towards each other could have been other reasons. This isolation from the community kind of created loneliness in her life, but she didn't let it take over. Since her only desire was to begin writing poetry, she focused on that and started her career. When Emily started writing her poems, she really only shared them with Susan Gilbert. She sent over 270 of her poems to Susan, and they're often thought to have been written for her, as there was a lot of passion and care within them. These letters and poems kind of sparked rumors years later that Emily and Susan had a love affair or romantic relationship, but there was never really any proof, and as I said before, they later got into some kind of fight that left their relationship less close. During her successful writing years, Emily developed eye problems. It was around the 1860s that they became noticeable enough that she was going to doctors for it. She became very fearful of losing her sight and not being able to continue her poetry. These problems continued until she died, but they never stopped her from writing. During this time, she also had two significant correspondents, Samuel Bowles and Josiah Holland. They were both publishers at newspapers. They helped her get 7 of her poems published in the newspapers, but nothing further than that. It was also believed that Samuel Bowles and Emily were in some kind of romantic relationship, as there was a letter sent by Emily with a love confession in it, but no one's ever confirmed that it was actually to Samuel Bowles, just that she had an interest in somebody who was already married and had no interest in her. Throughout her career, she wrote over 1,800 poems, which weren't found until after she died, actually. And her first poetry collection was published in 1890 after she died, by a publisher she turned down quite a few times before she died, and he only published them after Emily's sister Vinnie found her poems while burning her correspondent letters, and insisted that they be published for Emily. Now, before I move on to the symptoms of Emily's mental illness, I do want to talk about some of the events that I think impacted the way that her symptoms came across in her life. First, Emily's childhood home was in front of a cemetery during a time where tuberculosis was at an all-time high. This meant there was a lot of death and a lot of funerals around Emily from a very young age. Then in 1844, Emily lost many friends and family in a very short period of time. She lost her cousin Sophia Holland, who had a big impact on her and really impacted the way that she felt towards death and immortality, which came across in her poetry. This was also the first and last time that Emily was recorded to have experienced a depressive episode. In 1874, Emily's father dies unexpectedly and away from home. A year later, Emily's mother has a stroke, which doesn't kill her, but Emily does have to care for her for the next 7 years. Emily's mother does die in 1882. And in 1883, Emily's most significant loss occurs, which is her nephew, Austin and Susan's son. This death was kind of the last straw for her, as she had experienced so much in her life. This was when she was diagnosed with nervous prostration, which I will get into after this. But she was quoted to say, "The crisis of the sorrow of so many years is all that tires me." Now, this was the most significant mental health crisis that Emily has and would continue to have for the short time before she dies. So what is nervous prostration? Nervous prostration is also known as nervous exhaustion. At the time, it was an umbrella term for any physical symptoms of fear a person may experience. Some of the fears include open or closed spaces, society, and being alone. Other symptoms that went with this were anxiety, rapid breathing, heart palpitations, and sweating. Today, this would most likely be diagnosed as anxiety attacks or panic attacks, which is why I diagnosed Emily with an anxiety disorder. Emily also discussed her anxiety through her writing. She called it the phantom, and the phantom occurred throughout her writing, starting from the very beginning, even before she experienced her episode of nervous prostration. This reoccurring character was said to have diminished her strength and haunted her, and she was quoted to say she was too exhausted to resist it anymore. She said it ran after her, and she walked and quaked away from it. When she moved back to the homestead, she no longer talked about losing against the phantom, but she did still experience the anxiety or the phantom. Before she died, Emily did experience 2 more blackouts or episodes of nervous prostration, but she did not experience them consistently. Emily also had anxiety about being outside of her house. It was considered the center of her daily world after she returned from Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in 1847. After she returned, she did not leave Amherst more than 3 times and never for longer than a few months. 2 of the times that she left Amherst were to go see a doctor. She stayed at her cousin's while she was getting surgery or medications for her eye problems. Emily also communicated mainly through letters and did not leave the house often. When she did, it was mostly to visit Susan and Austin, who had built a house down the road from the homestead, but those visits eventually dwindled as well. When Emily did leave her house, she was always accompanied by her dog Carlo, and that was why she was coined a recluse and hermit by the rest of the town. Emily's other anxieties included being in open spaces and in large groups. Emily wrote to Susan, "How big and broad the aisle seemed, full enough before, as I quaked slowly up and reached my usual seat. And therefore I sat and wondered, I was scared so." She actually wrote this about being in a church and looking up and just seeing so much open space. During this letter, she also wrote about needing to calm herself from the fear. In terms of her preference for smaller groups, as I said earlier, Emily never had a large group of friends, and the only group she did have was pretty small. After that, she had individual friends and correspondence, but she never married and rarely ever knew or visited her friends in person. She also considered letters the best form of communication. She said it cut out polite conversation and it is the mind alone. She really disliked small talk or having conversations face to face, but she did show passion and care in her letters, which is why I never considered a personality disorder as Emily's diagnosis. Instead, I do think it relates to her anxieties. Emily's anxieties and symptoms did persist for longer than 6 months, which is what is needed for an anxiety disorder or specifically agoraphobia diagnosis. Many of those anxieties were thought to have began in 1847 and continued until 1886 when she died. Through her writing, we could see her anxieties and fears persist throughout many different stages of her life. Then there's a couple of behaviors that I think pointed towards anxiety that weren't necessarily criteria, but I felt important details to add. She did sort her poetry into very distinct groups. Starting in 1858, as I said, she had over 1,800 poems, and it was considered odd and not just an organization thing, but I think that kind of pointed towards needing that specific way of life or way of organization that sometimes can go with anxiety disorders. Another observation was she used vivid imagery. It was based on her fears and anxieties that she was experiencing, which made her writing that much better, but so many people found that her imagery was just so distinct and descriptive that it couldn't have come from anywhere besides her own mind. And lastly, she published those 7 poems in the newspaper under a different name. That was the only publication that she ever did when she was alive, and many believe it's because she didn't want people to know her name, and she didn't want people to know her poems were from her. She actually only shared her poems with a small group of friends. Many of them were through letters. I don't think she ever shared the poems with anyone in person, and she showed negative feelings towards publication after those few in the newspaper. She denied publishing, and she just didn't seem interested in people knowing her name. Based on the information I have gathered, I am diagnosing Emily Dickinson with an anxiety disorder, specifically agoraphobia. Emily met more than 2 of the agoraphobia criteria needed for the diagnosis. She had anxiety about being outside of the house, anxiety about being in an open space, panic attacks, persistent symptoms for over 6 months, and was avoidant of leaving the house. All these point to an agoraphobia diagnosis. Thank you.